Well, welcome to episode 262 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Roland Kirk's album, The Inflated from 1968, which is his debut on Atlantic Records. This is a Japanese reissue from 1976, which, like almost all Japanese presses, has incredibly silent vinyl and was cared for by some very loving Japanese owners prior to me buying it, for which I'm incredibly grateful. Rahsaan Roland Kirk, who was still Roland Kirk at the time he made this record, is one of the most underappreciated artists in the history of jazz. Like other jazz musicians who come to mind, like Mingus, to a certain extent Monk, he had more to say than could comfortably fit in the medium, and so his music is full of experimentation and the sense of restlessness. He was routinely politically outspoken. His concerts would be interspersed with discussions of Black history and civil rights, and he kept this up. In the 1970s, he had a movement called the Jazz and the People's Movement, which was all about getting more airtime for jazz musicians who he felt were being marginalized. And he ends up disrupting The Tonight Show, The Merv Griffin Show, The Dick Cavett Show. Strangely enough, these disruptive events are not actually included on the archives of these shows, which are now available online, but you can see a fascinating clip of Kirk with Archie Shepp, Charles Mingus, and Roy Haynes playing The Ed Sullivan Show in 1970, and I put that link down below. His composition and his playing draws not just on the usual suspects of jazz and R&B, but also from pop and classical, and he's one of these artists who didn't like being stuck in that shoebox called jazz, and he preferred to call his music black classical, and actually in that Ed Sullivan clip that I mentioned, he introduces his music as black music. Given all of that, this record still has really broad appeal. It is not straight-ahead hard bop, but nonetheless, it's very upbeat and very approachable. Rahsaan Roland Kirk is born Ronald Kirk in Columbus, Ohio in 1936. When he's born, he has sight, but due to some kind of medical screw-up, he loses his sight at age 2. He was incredibly gifted and musically voracious from the very beginning. He starts with a bugle and the trumpet, but then he moves on to reed instruments, and by the time he was 15 years old, he's touring and playing with traveling R&B bands in Ohio to make money on the weekends. When he was 16, he had a dream about playing 3 different kinds of saxophone at once. Following up on this dream, he begins to shop for additional saxophones to include in his act, and he goes looking in pawn shops. There he finds and purchases a couple of really quite old-fashioned instruments. One of them was a soprano saxello, and the second was this straight alto sax. Instead of the bell curving upwards like this, as it does on most saxophones, it flared out straight down towards the bottom. He modifies both of these so that he can have 3 saxophones hanging around his neck during performance at one time. His usual tenor sax, plus the saxello, which he renames the manzello, and the straight alto, which he calls the stritch. His interest and ability on different instruments didn't end there. He also played the flute, played the harmonica, he played the cor anglais, or the English horn, and he would also make his own instruments from various things he had lying around. He had a nose flute that he would play from his nose, and he would also occasionally incorporate the penny whistle. At this point, he had pretty much locked up the title of most eccentric performer in jazz, but he also took time, somewhere in the late 50s or early 60s, to master the technique of circular breathing, where you store breath in your cheeks, but you're breathing in through your nose while you're blowing out in your horn through your mouth so that you can keep one note going or a run of notes going for a long time. And there's a lot of that technique on here. In 1956, at age 20, he makes the record Triple Threat. A local Ohio label called King Records puts that out. The world wasn't quite ready for him then. In fact, even the liner notes in that record are kind of dismissive of his multi-instrumentalism. There's a little bit of tenor sax snobbery at play there. He spent some time in Louisville and in Chicago before eventually pitching up in New York sometime around 1960, where he hooks up with Charles Mingus and joins the Jazz Workshop. He also records his sole record for Argo in 1961, introducing Roland Kirk. He's in demand as a sideman to a degree, though he doesn't really appear on too many records as a sideman. The ones he does are quite notable. Those include Mingus's record Oh Yeah, Roy Haynes' record Out of the Afternoon, and famously, he's also the guy who plays the flute on the single by Quincy Jones' Soul Bossa Nova, which of course in recent years has been reincarnated as a theme song to Austin Powers. From that point on in the 1960s, he basically records as a leader. His music is pretty much always rooted in the blues, it's always experimental, it's always technically brilliant, and he's always able to attract some pretty heavy-duty sidemen to his records. These include Jack McDuff and Art Taylor, who appear on Kirk's work in 1961, Andrew Hill, Herbie Hancock, and Roy Haynes, who all appear on 1962's Domino, Richard Davis on Reeds and Deeds in 1963, and then the incredible quartet, really incredible quartet, which appears on Rig, Rip, and Panic, Kirk's album from 1965, including Davis, Jackie Bayard, and Elvin Jones, as well as Kirk. Kirk in this period is also a real fixture in the New York jazz scene, not just for his gigs, but also for appearing at various jam sessions and getting into basically jam duels with all kinds of different players, not really respecting reputations. He was appreciated by and was close with some of the avant-garde players who could see his incredible technical ability. Even though he never really played that much in the avant-garde lane, they knew that he could. But for others, particularly the guys that he felt really could only play the free stuff and didn't actually have the grounding in playing the changes in traditional jazz music, he was pretty unforgiving. In 1967, after making a whole bunch of records for Mercury, he switches over to Verve for one album, Please Don't You Cry, Beautiful Edith, and then he moves to Atlantic Records and begins to make a bunch of marquee records for that marquee jazz label, of which this is the first. This record is made between November 27th and November 30th, 1967, at Webster Hall in New York City. The producer was a guy called Joel Dorn, who had taken over as Kirk's producer when he moved to Atlantic Records. Kirk, of course, is here, along with an entire table full of instruments, which I actually have to read because there's no way I could ever memorize that. And that's the tenor sax, the manzello, the stritch, the clarinet, the flute, the penny whistle, the cor anglais, or the English horn, and the flexitone. With him, for the first time on record, are a group of guys who would go on to be his settled band in the late 60s and early 70s, both on record and in performance, including Ron Burton on piano, Jimmy Hops on drums, and Steve Novosel on bass. The liner notes also credit a Dick Griffith on trombone. It's actually Dick Griffin, and he actually appears on the Ed Sullivan clip I mentioned before. Side one starts with the Black and Crazy Blues, and we're right into full-on Kirk here. This is kind of a shuffling beat, very much like a New Orleans funeral march. You get Kirk on, I think, the cor anglais, the English horn. You then have a wonderful piano solo from Burton. You then get Kirk again on two horns. It's fascinating. It's a beautiful track. Next is A Laugh for Rory, which is a cheerful, upbeat, quite short little tune, chiefly memorable for the great solo that Kirk plays on flute and never missing a chance to double up. He does a bit of singing while he's playing as well. Then we have Many Blessings, which is kind of a remarkable piece, certainly a highlight on the record. This has Kirk on tenor, and he's using that circular breathing technique, playing what quickly becomes apparent as a really long and extended run. And I don't really know quite sometimes what I think about this. I'm so used to, as we all are, listening to saxophone where the player is pausing for breath, and Kirk just doesn't, and it goes on. I didn't time it, but certainly it's probably 30 seconds or more. It's a little unsettling. Not that it's bad, just a little odd. The last track on side one is Fingers in the Wind. Kirk is on flute here, and as much as his soloing and playing is great, what's really sweet about this track is the interplay between him and Burton, who is basically comping, but more than comping behind him. Side two starts with the title track, The Inflated Tear, and this is an amazing showpiece for Kirk. He's playing multiple horns here at different times, and the magic is really this juxtaposition between his multi-horn playing and this melody which he plays alternating with the multi-horn bit on the stritch, which has a totally different feel. After the stop-start feel of that first track, we then get an Ellington cover, Creole Love Call, which is a very swinging treatment. Handful of Fives is basically a showpiece for Kirk on the manzello. Fly By Night is a track where Dick Griffin joins on trombone. Kirk has a great solo on tenor. If there's a critique to be made here, and it's a critique which is sometimes leveled in general at Kirk, is that he doesn't leave a lot of room for the other players on the record. There are some other solos here. People don't usually get more than 4, well, maybe 8 bars. Sometimes his exuberance and multifaceted ability takes over a little bit in this record, and it might have been a case where less was more. The final track, Love Levoliliquy, is a great one. Kirk is playing alto, fantastic. Burton is back with more of a spotlight than previously. And Hops' work on drums really makes the whole quartet sound like the Coltrane Quartet here. This is another great track. The critique of Kirk leveled at the height of his career by his peers was that there was just too much going on when he was on stage. It was kind of a circus act. I think that criticism is well wide of the mark here. This record is about 1 part quirky, 9 parts beautiful, interesting experimentation. There are lots of good songs here, lots of great compositions, and needless to say, lots of virtuosity, at times a little bit distracting. But even if there might have been more room for a sideman, this is still a wonderful entryway into this magnificent artist. Recommend it strongly. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.